Good morning. My name is Rachel Shield, and I'm the Director of Engagement here at Westminster. And I am so excited to start this series. As many of you know, our adult ed year, we have focused on the question of dismantling privilege. And the theme has been reckoning with privilege, where Christ leads the church when the world is disrupted. And this fall, we had a series of really wonderful conversations with theologians around this topic. And this spring, we're shifting towards practical application of this theology, applied theology. What does it actually look like to dismantle privilege? And specifically, what does it look like within our the vocational circles that we engage in, that we belong to? And so our first, we've invited folks who are doing this in their lives, who are doing this in their communities, to lead us in this conversation. That's Stephanie will be our conversation guide today. And then at the table, we've also asked some folks from our own community who are interested in this question and engaging through this specific vocational lens to join us as well. So I would like to introduce Stephanie for this first conversation entitled Lean In, Lament, Leverage, Dismantling Our Privilege in Our Everyday Spaces. Pastor Stephanie Williams O'Brien is the lead pastor at Mill City Church in Northeast Minneapolis. She is also a professor of ministry at Bethel University and Seminary in St. Paul. Stephanie has opportunities to coach leaders around the world through speaking, developing resources, and her podcast, Lead Stories, with her friend Joe Saxton. She is a sought-after leadership coach, helping women and men to be intentional with their influence in all aspects of their lives. Pastor Steph is passionate about communities and individuals participating in the mission of God to the world. Her first book was released in the fall of 2019, Stay Curious: How Questions and Doubts Can Save Your Faith. And you can learn more about her work at pastorsteph.com. We are so glad you're here with us. I'll have to excuse my dog, who's also very curious about this conversation, in the back.
Yeah, my dogs are probably going to join in at some point here too. Well, great. Thank you. I'm really, really honored to be with everybody and to have a chance. I'm just, what a great thing that we have this technology, even though it's been a tough season. I'm so grateful that we have it. So I am a church planter, and I helped start Mill City almost 13 years ago. So I like to make the joke that I was only 13 years old, but of course I wasn't that young, but I was young and ambitious to say, what does it look like to start a new faith community? So me and a friend that I met in seminary and some other folks thought, let's give it a try. And so we have been a church that has always felt it was important to honor the established church. And so to be communicating with all of you as a historic church is really an honor. And we have tried to partner with the churches in our really local area in Northeast Minneapolis, of which there's a number of historic churches as well. And we just felt like, like anything else, a new church, a new life comes in and brings something new, and that benefits the people who've been there for a long time too. And so we've hoped to be a benefit to the other churches in the area. And we've just loved our partnerships with churches between, I think the oldest one is 150, and then down to some brand new church plants that are just starting now. And we're so grateful to be a part of the church Big C and to see that ecumenical opportunity to just join in God's mission together. But for us, I think when we were starting Mill City, the idea was, what does it look like for us to follow this theology? Like, I love what you said about practical theology, because it's so practical to me, but follow this theology, which brings this question: what is God already doing in a location? Is God already doing something in Northeast Minneapolis? Of course God is. That's why there's already these churches here. But those churches didn't bring God to this area either, right? God was already doing something here in this part of the city. And I'm going to say here because I'm sitting in Northeast Minneapolis where I live as well. And so the question, that theological question, has really been the guide for everything that we've done in these last 13 years. When we ask this question, what is God doing? We recognize there's a little bit of a mystical idea to that, right? It's a little bit mystic, and I'm into that. And so the idea is like, how do we know what the Spirit's doing wherever we are? And we don't ever know for sure, but the adventure of trying to figure out is kind of what we're all about. And so it comes into play, I think, in really important ways in this conversation that we're going to have tonight, this theology. So that's going to be something that I bring to the forefront, having a theology that really is focused and centered on God's agency, and that human agency and human action is the choice that we have to join in what God's doing, and God's redemption and restoration and restorative power in the world, and absolutely necessary for us in order to be people who dismantle privilege. Man, we're going to need the Holy Spirit's help, and we're going to need the empowerment of the Holy Spirit, or we can't do it. And we can't save ourselves from ourselves without without God's help, in my opinion. And so I just see that as so core. Just a little bit about our church then. We're not a very big church, maybe about 300 people or so. And we are kind of all over the place generationally. We've got a lot of little kids and a lot of single people, kind of an unusual amount of single people in a good way. We just love our singles and people into their 40s and 50s who are single. We really embrace that. And we've got increasingly diverse church in all different ways. But if I was going to say the number one point of diversity is probably spiritual background in our church. So that's just kind of interesting. We've got folks who've come from all different backgrounds, from mainline background to Pentecostal to not growing up in the church at all, to Baptist and all of the things. And so it's just been an interesting kind of group of people to try to figure out how we answer the question, what is God doing together? Because everyone's got a lot of different thoughts about that. But another real focus of our church was the geographic location. And so when we started, there was actually about 30 of us that ended up moving to this part of the city so that we could ask that question in a really focused way. And now our church is pretty regional, but the idea that being there to this question, what is God doing in our everyday spaces, starting with the neighborhood in which we're going to worship in. And then as we go from there into our, what I always say, is our everyday spaces, the places where we live, we learn, we play, we spend time, we spend money. These are places we are all the time. And so I think it's such an important question to say, how can we join in God's mission everywhere that we are, especially in these everyday spaces, because we're there every day. And so I think about that in regards to workplace and lots of things. But I think today we want to focus just a little bit on kind of our neighborhoods, where we live, the people that we spend the most time around. Maybe you're familiar with the term third space. So coffee shops, breweries. I'm in breweries most of the time because I'm in Northeast. Different types of gatherings, libraries, things like that, spaces that we're entering back into a little bit more now. And how we notice the ways in which we exist in those spaces, and what that means for being people who, all of us have different levels of privilege as we enter into spaces, and how we acknowledge that and recognize that, and how we step into those spaces. And so, like I said, for me, there's a question that's very practical, sociological, how do I dismantle privilege, but also spirit-led. I really think that God can help us have wisdom as we enter into these spaces, and that if we're paying attention to what God's doing, a prayer that I often pray is, God, open up my eyes to what you're doing and attune my ears to your voice so that I can know what you're saying and what you're doing and join into that. Because when you come into an area like Northeast Minneapolis, like South Minneapolis, like any suburb of the Twin Cities, they're all very different. And there's tons of things we could do. The list of things that we could do is very long. So there's actually kind of a process of having to discern, well, of all the things that I could do, how can I and should I specifically, and then maybe we as a community or as a family, a nuclear family, how can we join into what God's doing in this specific area and actually narrow it down? So I've seen stories of people do this in many different ways. And sometimes it's by a nuclear family, and other times it's in more of like a community aspect. One of the I call it like vehicles for mission that we have in our church, we call missional community. And what that is similar to a small group, except usually the group can be a little bit bigger, and they pick one kind of mission together. So for instance, here in Northeast, it's the Arts District, as many people know, historic Arts District here in Northeast Minneapolis. And so amongst the many groups of people that are here in Northeast, one of the groups is the artist community. And don't have to know too much about the artist community to know that it's a group of people who struggles to feel understood sometimes. The term starving artist is a term for a reason, and they're trying to figure out how to make it here. And we had a group of people who, through this process of discernment, said, what if we formed a community that tried to figure out how to love the artist community in the name of Jesus, and just give them whatever we can, serve them, show them value, show them worth, and notice what's going on in their life and work, and notice that amongst the demographics, the artist community has different challenges. And then people who are on the margins, who are also in the artist community, of course, people who are marginalized for any reason, are gonna have even more of an uphill struggle in which it looks like to be people who do their art and live in the way that they do. And so this group of people has come into the space trying to figure this out. And it looks just like a lot of experiments is probably the best way to put it. If you hear anything from me tonight, I hope it's the idea of experimenting to figure out how we can do this work. Because when we step into it, I really feel like I said, there's a million things we could do. We have to discern what to try, and then we just need to actually try, because some of our best efforts don't lead to what we always hope that they would. But at the same time, an experiment is one in which you always learn. You always learn something from an experiment. And so, for instance, this group of people, they call themselves craft, like the art, the craft of being artists. And they are all artists themselves, of course. And they decided, well, let's just do some experiments. And so one of the things they did was they held an art gallery, and they said anybody can bring their art here. There's no entrance fee, but this is going to be juried by actual jurors, and we're going to raise the money to pay for this gallery so that your art can be displayed, so people might purchase your art. And this group of people was reached out to in this way because of this group of people creating that. One kind of cool story is that last year, the largest art crawl that we have in the Midwest, Art-A-Whirl, which is here in Northeast, had to be canceled because of COVID. But our little group, and people don't even realize this, but our little group reached out to the Art Association and just said, hey, what if we try to put it online? And they our little group of people recruited videographers and photographers to volunteer to document people's studios so that there could be an online Art-A-Whirl. And they didn't take any credit for that, but I know that they did that. And I know that they edited a lot of the videos and did a lot of that work as a way to say, look at this group of people, especially in this time, are going to have a struggle. And so they leverage their privilege by reaching out to people and asking for pro bono work, people who are in marketing, people who are making a lot of money still, who didn't have as much job insecurity during the pandemic, and invited them to volunteer and give their time to make sure these artists still had their work displayed, because Art-A-Whirl is one of the times people make the most money as an artist. One other story I'll tell you about a group, a missional community that's come together. They call themselves Women of Peace. And they are all women on purpose because their mission is to figure out how to love the Muslim women in our town. Here in Northeast, as other parts of the Twin Cities, of course, the Somali population is more dense here than anywhere else in the world except for Somalia. And so almost all of those folks have a Muslim perspective and Muslim faith. And so it's important that if you're going to build relationships, it's gendered. And so for our group, despite some of the challenges of having a women only group, the women in that group and people who identify as women came together and said, how do we figure out how to build relationships? Because there's this huge barrier between Christians and Muslims. And so they decided to experiment. And their experiment was, instead of inviting these women to come to our space, we're going to see if we can get invited to join them. Well, sure enough, they figured out that there are all these dinners and things that people are very much wanting and inviting the community to come in and to learn about during different seasons like Ramadan. And so they started to join in and got more people in our church involved. And so I think there's something really key about that, doing it together. And when I say groups, these aren't huge groups of people. They're just a few people with a similar heart and feeling called to a similar area of mission and saying, how can we do this together? And then when those women, for instance, aren't meeting with the Muslim women, they're reading books about how to be allies as white women. Not all of them are white, but many of them are. What does it look like for us to be culturally sensitive? What does it look like for us to pay attention to the specific needs of this group of people and to read about the experiences that they're experiencing, and not just try to ask them to be the ones to educate us, but that we will also do our work in that way. And they encourage each other in that way. But I've also seen people really figuring out how to do some of this in their nuclear family or as individuals. Some of you might have heard recently, one of the major pushes that's happening right now is for people to pay attention to the land covenants that are on their properties. And so groups like Just Deed are coming in and helping people to just strike from the record the idea that someone couldn't buy their property unless they were Caucasian or white, or whatever language was used back then. And so it's a small thing, but it's a big thing, right? It's paying attention, it's acknowledging what's happened, not to mention whoever owned this land and was living on this land before we were here, as far as Indigenous people. And so there's these little things that families can do that are actually big things, to talk to their kids about that. I think more powerful than, I don't know, telling their neighbors that they changed the land covenant would be the conversation they have with their kids around why it was important that they changed the language and made sure that language was no longer present in their, in the history of their deed. I just think the ripple effect of some of this type of thing is so powerful. And then, one other thing that people have really paid attention to is where you're spending your money in your neighborhood. Every neighborhood, including suburbs, there are, first of all, family-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, businesses owned by people of color. Sometimes we have to just really do our homework and recognize that even some of the businesses that are serving people of color are still owned by white people who are making the most money from these things. And it's not that everybody shouldn't have an opportunity to participate in business, but when we know that we can be more intentional with diversifying how we invest our money. We think about that as people of privilege all the time, right? I want to diversify my investments. And that usually means, a little bit of stocks, a little bit of bonds, whatever. But how about diversifying our investment when it comes to our local community? There's nothing wrong with going through a Starbucks every once in a while, but is there a local coffee shop that is owned by, a woman or someone from various different perspectives that would really be so blessed by the finances being invested into their business and bringing people by? And what does it look like to try to celebrate and to give credit towards these folks who oftentimes won't have the same marketing budget as a Starbucks or something else that's going to be to make sure that it's on the front page and coming up on everyone's phones and things like that. So there's just these little ways, and then these big ways, right, to figure out how to join in. One final idea that I'll offer is the phrase that maybe some of you have heard, this is very practical, is NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, NIMBY. This idea that everybody knows there's a housing crisis, but nobody wants it in their backyard to be answered in their backyard. And this is a way in which we as people of faith can recognize our privilege and lean in, like I said, leaning into that and lamenting over the idea that there's not enough housing for different income levels in our city. And be people who say, is there a way I can leverage what I have in order to help people access more affordable housing? And there's lots of ways people can do that if they think about it. One of those ways being many properties, particularly in certain Minneapolis and some other more progressive suburbs, will allow for accessory dwelling units to be built on your property so that people can live there who are maybe more in a middle or lower income, where they can still afford to pay for housing, but just not the out of control prices. And so is it a huge privilege to have a property? Yeah. Is it a lot of work or maybe some risk to build more space on your property and allow other people to live there? Sure. But who is going to step into these things and dismantle some of the privilege that we have by owning land to share that? And perhaps for other people, it's not that they could do that, but they could invest in a property like that being added. Maybe someone they can't have the zoning on their property, but they could help pay for someone else to do that on their property as an investment that would be paid back because of the rent. There's just lots of creative ways, I think, if we start to really think about how we can be people who recognize that privilege and, like I said, leaning into it or paying attention to it, that it's there, lamenting it, because I do think that we need to pause and recognize how much pain it's caused people. And when we jump into action, we can miss the lamenting or even like repenting of the ways we didn't even know we were joining into and being complicit and stuff. But then finally trying to leverage it and say, is there some way I can leverage what I have in order to allow other people to step into the space and to use their voice, not to speak for them, but to give space for other people's voices, because people have a voice, not to do the work for them, but to get out of the way and help remove barriers that shouldn't be there in the first place for people to step into thriving. So those are some ideas I have and some experiences that I've seen. I wonder from those of you who are here, kind of what you thought about when it comes to your everyday spaces. What have you seen? What have you wondered about? What are some things that you've seen people try, and how has that looked in your life, or ideas maybe that you have for the future of what this could look like to take action and make this theology practical in your life? Any thoughts?
Well, to follow up on the just deeds, Mapping Prejudice is a University of Minnesota
Yes.
project that actually has done the research on where the deed covenants exist that Just Deeds is using. And they still are calling for volunteers to do the deed research. And so on the Mapping Prejudice website, there's a process for becoming a volunteer and getting trained on how to do the research so that it can expand beyond the properties that they've already researched.
Yeah, that's so good. Also, the Mapping Prejudice has a great Instagram group. So if you're an Instagram person, this is an easy way. When I see some certain things pop up, I just share it. And folks say, oh my goodness, I didn't have any idea. And so like Doug said, you can head to the website and figure out how to get involved really practically, but also getting the word out because they're doing a great job marketing what's happening. Yeah, great.
You know, as we're going through the trial of Derek Chauvin, there is the opportunity. Our city prayer tent operates in North Minneapolis, and at 8 o'clock every morning, there's a 20-minute or so Zoom prayer session from North Minneapolis that will happen every day as long as the trial is going on. And it's a way to join in with folks in North Minneapolis and around the whole community to say, I want to be a part of this group that's praying for the justice and love of our city.
So good.
And so it's a really easy way to connect through a prayer group that's so focused on criminal justice and racial justice.
That's fantastic. Yes. What a burden and opportunity our city has right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Other thoughts?
I was going to jump off of an idea you mentioned, Stephanie, around doing the work. I think that that's a really interesting phrase that's kind of been like caught on a lot. I think like within pop culture, I think within especially white-bodied individuals who are trying to understand their own place within the racist histories that we have lived and learned and been taught, in particular within race, but within other privileged spaces. And I think that when we say doing the work, I think that that inevitably also elicits a sense of privilege because doing the work is a choice. And the mere fact that it is a choice is a sense of privilege because we are choosing to engage in the work. We are choosing to think and be self-reflective, becoming more aware, because as within, when we talk about white privilege or within racism, it is a choice to not be thinking about that. That's the whole essence of white supremacy. And so when we get into these spaces of talking about privilege, I think that just doing some really intentional self-awareness and active before jumping into spaces is really going to be helpful. Why do I want to learn more? Why do I want to volunteer, which is an amazing opportunity? Having some of those intentional goals and thoughts, I think, can really be help to ground not only yourself, because jumping into this work, you don't want to jump into the deep end. You kind of want to go through it slowly because we have been transitioned or kind of, brought up in a certain way to be able to see these things. And so doing this work can be very rewarding and has been difficult, but I would definitely encourage, I guess, to your question of what do you see on like at an individual level, I would say reading content from Black authors, being really intentional. I really like your idea of diversifying not only your money, but I like to think of diversifying the media and what I consume. So am I watching? Am I reading? Am I listening? Am I being intentional about exploring that, especially for children, for yourself, for your parents, giving recommendations? I think there's so much power. There's a lot of capitalism there that we can kind of help to shift some of those priorities that we tend to see the same content over and over. So how do we shift that? But I would say doing the work is just a choice, and really putting that into practice does take some time to stop and pause and think through what your role is. And I've had to do a lot of that reflection over the last few years that I've been intentional about doing this work, because each of us have a role to play in some of that. And I would recommend one piece if people are looking for literature. Resma Manikim has a book out that's called My Grandmother's Hands, which is an incredibly powerful and self-reflective piece to really go through what does it mean from a bodily perspective and how our own body holds a lot of trauma, especially as white bodies. And what does that mean when we go out into the world? What does it mean when we are seeing content that is destructive? What does it mean when we may be furthering issues that we either mean to, but we just inevitably do? And so learning how to process that, and then really having a trusted person with your similar cultural background to share those experiences with, because by building community is when we help to do culture shift, and that takes time and effort. And again, that is another choice. And so I'm really appreciative of the conversation, because I think the very first step needs to be you at an individual level, kind of really asking those tough questions of why do I want to do this, and really being critical, but also being really open, because we can learn so much if we just start to kind of look internally first.
Yeah, I was going to mention My Grandmother's Hands as well. That is such a great work. And in fact, I listened to the audiobook, so he like read it to me. I just love that part too. And just this idea of we can't acknowledge trauma in our bodies because we're disconnected from our bodies in this way of deracializing and not seeing ourselves as having culture, sometimes not seeing ourselves as being a part of the racial hierarchy. And so that's all a precursor to acknowledge the trauma that's happened because of that. And we want to jump to someone else's trauma and how we can fix it, because that's going to make us feel better about how uncomfortable it makes us feel that we might have missed something for so long or been unaware or ignorant in that way. But I absolutely agree, Taylor. It's so challenging to recognize we can just put it down if we want to. I don't have to think about race every day. I can exist even in a multi-ethnic neighborhood without really thinking about it if I want to, because of how strong the privilege is that I have in that way. I can pay attention if I want to, but that's, like you said, inherently the problem and the situation. And when we look at years like this, where we have the pandemic of COVID-19, as well as the pandemic of racism that's always been there, that's coming to the surface in a new way, and because of George Floyd and his murder, I think there's this tendency to say, but right now I'm so tired. Of course we are. It's so exhausting. I feel isolated. We feel all these things, yet we still are feeling all these and experiencing all these things with so much more privilege than so many other people. But the tendency, I feel like what this year did was show the tendency to check out that we have when we have that choice. And it took even more, I think, choice to stay present in it when there's a lot of excuses, so to speak, that are real, because the pandemic was traumatic, obviously, and it brought so much wear and tear on all of us emotionally. Yet we were right here in our city, almost, confronted almost just as deeply as the pandemic, right? With everything that people are facing. So yes, so good. And checking our motivation. That's just a really good word from what you said.
Yeah, I would piggyback on that in terms of discerning the difference between trying to fix it versus being a good ally. And as you were talking about various things that one could be doing, I was thinking, oh my gosh, I have literally been in a tiny little bubble for the last year. I mean, yeah. I have not ventured out very far. And so it just struck me as, oh my gosh, there are a lot of opportunities. And so trying to discern what are the best opportunities for each individual. And I would say that it's really important, whatever somebody chooses, that they do so with full commitment. That I think a lot of people like to try things, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. But if it's an occasion in which it's really going to require a longer term commitment, that people are honest about whether they can make that commitment or not, because I think that can often do more damage in the long run. And so I would just put that out as caution. One of the activities that I have done through this year is the Presbytery pilgrimage, and we've been meeting as a larger group, and I know Doug is participating in that, and that's been it's been an interesting process to be with people I really don't know. The only thing we really have in common is that we're Presbyterians, and coming together and reading materials that most of us have had no exposure to before, history, and so trying to, just kind of peel back that onion a little bit more and learning more. And I know through my own process, I started doing this internal work in around 2013 for a number of different reasons. And I, it's fits and starts. Some days I feel I've got the courage and the strength to fully participate, and then in other times I feel like I am very unqualified to be doing any of this, and I feel like I need to step back, and so trying to figure out how we deal with those, because that is privilege, really, and I know that, but it's also how I feel. And so there's some guilt around that at times too, and so there are all these things coming at us, that need to be held and acknowledged as we move forward.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension there.
I think one of the places where we can make intentional choices is to listen to and decide to be led by Black leadership organizations. To give up, for me, I have had a lot of history being out front on political issues. I know you'll be shocked to hear that. But I
don't even know you, and I can tell.
Yeah, I'm going to find out what Reclaim the Block says about policing, and I may just be scared to death of the language of defund the police.
Mm-hmm.
But I could decide to go to this organization that is Black led and has a very carefully thought out process, and align myself with them, even though it's not where I would have gone or how I would have done it.
Right.
And to give up how I would have done it, to join in as an ally in a Black-led organization. Reclaim the Block is also gave a lot of public testimony in city budget hearings about taking money from the police and putting it in other public safety, but they also supported affordable housing as a place where a lot of that money needs to go. And so with their help and others, Minneapolis has now eliminated single family zoning, so that every parcel in the city can have up to a triplex. They could have a single accessory unit, or they could put up a smaller building. That is not, I don't think there's a single unit that's been produced yet, but that gives the freedom as the developers and others figure out how to do that, because they've never had the opportunity to do that. It's a system-wide change that's a part of the 2040 study that is required by the Met Council.
Yeah, that's great. I love what you said about following leaders of color and looking at what it means to, I mean, I think I just want to use the word like submit yourself to someone else's authority, like giving them, as Jesus followers, we might say, even like letting them have spiritual authority in our life to speak in ways that we're going to choose to let go of some of our preconceived notions and listen in that way and normalize changing our perspective when we get a new piece of information. I mean, for real, that is such a struggle. But what if it was just normal that when you are presented with things that you have never thought about in your life, that you would come up with different conclusions that you might have even held for 20, 30 years. And it's challenging, and change and grief and all that comes with that. But the power that I have found in submitting myself to the leadership of people who are different than me in lots of different ways has only produced positive fruit in the long run in my life. As hard as it's only been positive for me, and I've only learned from it. And I can't speak to that highly enough. And I love what Taylor said earlier, how it can look like who's you're having your earbuds, right? We're already consuming something. So we're just checking the sources and saying, okay, sometimes it's maybe uncomfortable language to say this, but the world is discipling us in some way, right? We're being formed like by everything all the time. And so when we take just a little bit more intentionality towards what's forming us, our phones and what we're listening to, and saying, well, what medium do you read books? Do you like podcasts? Are you someone who scrolls through? Just adding in some very intentional choices about who's producing this, who's at the back of this, obviously economically, but even just for the stories that are being told. It's not neutral. Hearing stories is not neutral. And so if we hear stories predominantly from middle-class white people, there's nothing wrong with those stories. But if that's the only stories we hear, then that's the only stories that are shaping us. And so it's not neutral to take in that information in those stories. So maybe you say, look, I don't listen to podcasts or read books. Well, then what TV shows? Look at the TV shows. There are lots of opportunities for people who are bringing their art to the forefront that have writers, producers, directors that are coming from different ethnic backgrounds, and it will shape you differently. So it's not only about trying to find time to get on the streets. It's not only about trying to find time actively, but also in some of the passive things that happen in our life when we're intentional. I mean, there it is. And that's helping us be formed in the ways that I think a lot of us hope to be. That's great.
Ramadan starts next week, and the Minnesota Council of Churches produced these blessed Ramadan signs that welcome and acknowledge our Muslim neighbors. And I think lawn signs can be poo-pooed, but it's a statement to your neighbors of where you stand on an important issue by having that in your lawn.
Yeah.
Westminster has produced these "No Justice, No Peace" lawn signs, which are fairly aggressive. And
my lawn.
Not aggressive.
Mine got stolen. I feel like they're popular.
Oh, really? Well, we'll replace it. So, thinking about just these sort of public statements,
right,
that you can passively put on your lawn, but that marks you as somebody who's made some sort of specific commitment.
Yeah. I think as Christians right now, let's just say what's true. We're not getting a lot of good PR. The front page is not saying any kind things about Christians. And I think that can lead us to feel like almost to kind of hold back on that part of who we are. I want the lawn sign that says "No Justice, No Peace," but I don't want it to have a Jesus fish on it. And, none of us are probably going to do that. But at the same time, how can the perception shift about what it means to be a Jesus follower if we aren't honest with that? And in a way, if I have a Muslim neighbor, are they going to feel comfortable talking about their faith with me if I'm holding mine back? Or can I use that honesty and saying, this is who I am and this is what I care about as a Christian? I mean, this is where I've seen so many cool conversations. As a Christian, I want to have a conversation about defunding the police, not like in spite of being a Christian. and inviting that perspective from my neighbor so that they feel like I'm going to go first. This is who I am. This is where I'm coming from. Not I got a good press right now, but I'm a Christian who believes that we aren't going to see peace in our neighborhood if we don't see justice for everybody. And I just wonder about that. It's maybe a little bit of a provocative thought to be more forward about our faith, but not in order to change other people, but to be people who represent a perspective shift on the damage that's been done by many other people who use Jesus' name. I think Jesus maybe wants to have a what is it called when he has what is it when somebody's using someone's name and they file like a patent thing? You know what I'm talking about? Where,
Defamation.
well, yeah, or like when you have a business that's named the same as somebody else's business, that the phrase is leaving me, but like where he's saying like, nope, I don't want anyone to use my name. You can't use it. Everybody has to stop. I wouldn't be surprised if Jesus were here, if that's actually what he would say. It's like, no one can use my name anymore.
Well,
But
the
I
No
wonder about
Justice, No Peace sign actually has Westminster Presbyterian
Great.
Church.
Yeah,
inside.
I think that's so cool.
So it's up front about where this is coming from.
So cool. Yes, exactly.
I want to jump on, that was a funny comment you made, Stephanie, around, bad PR. But I think that I would like to challenge that a bit. And I think that there's something to be said of we as Christians need to embrace all of the PR and be able to say, what does that mean? And what does that mean about our faith? And how we be able to, something that I've been personally navigating is it's easy for me to other people and to put kind of, this is like a good Christian, or this is a bad Christian, or this is a good white person, or, kind of all this sense of, wanting to kind of do this me versus you. And I think there's something comforting and easy about that. And just trying to go through. And I think to, maybe kind of push the envelope a little bit is to say like, how do we as Christians be able to name that's my community member, and I need to figure out how to like relate and change and shift and be in a place in which not only can I go across into people that are my neighbors who don't have the same background as me, but also to those who do, but we have radically different viewpoints. And so whether that's my a relative or a neighbor or whatever it may be, being able to kind of navigate those things is that kind of extra challenge, because for me, it's been so difficult. But watching the Derek Chauvin trials be like, that is, for me, I work for the city of Minneapolis. That's my colleague on trial. What does that mean about having somebody who's a colleague, about somebody who's in my community, the white community? What does that mean as like another white male in this community in Minneapolis? To have some of those connections, because at the end of the day, if I'm able to go through that and struggle through that identity, then maybe that also helps me show up a bit more humbly, or a bit more like open, because that's kind of what all of this is about, right? It's at the end of the day, that othering or that kind of like decentering can really lead to some really terrible consequences, like this is that we live in. And so I think that there's a challenge there that I've been trying to embrace, and it's so difficult. But I think there's a great opportunity, and I think the church is such an amazing place to do that, because we all come from such different backgrounds. But if we're able to kind of come to these like universal truths, about being loving and caring and open, I mean, those are things that we can really carry with us regardless of some of these things. But trying to embrace that challenge.
That's so brilliant, Taylor. I love how you put that. And I just think that I've heard that refrain so many times. I've talked with many of my friends of color and said, I want to be here. I want to show up for you. And I've had in different ways, they say the same thing. We want you to be out here marching with us, but you need to also deal with your people. Like, we need you to deal with your people. Whether that's like, I love how you put that. Okay, people that are in the same faith or the same demographic or working as colleagues of the city of Minneapolis, in all of those different ways, how do we have opportunities to deal with our people, but deal with them in the relational way, and to say we are in the same group, and how do we have these conversations and fight that dualistic thinking of us and them. Because I think that would be such a good thing for all of us in these conversations. When we find ourselves like going into that dualistic thinking, we got to check ourselves, because that is exactly where we end up in that us versus them. And it feels, like you said, easier to say, well, I'm woke, or whatever terms people want to use, and I'm not like that. And then we're rendering ourselves useless in reaching across some of these differences and bringing some people into some really wonderful conversations. So for me, one of the things I've been trying to do, I do kind of have like I think of it as like a digital space. I have my digital space online where I think about interacting with people on that space. And I think about it really intentionally, because I know there's people that I might never not meet in person that I'm connecting with there. And so I think of my digital space as like my lawn, like my front lawn, and I can put stuff on my lawn. Look, if somebody throws trash in my lawn, though, I'm going to erase it. You can't just put trash in my lawn. But if you come up to me and we're in my front lawn and we're having a dialogue, then let's dialogue. Let's do that. And so sometimes on my social media, I will say, hey, here's some thoughts that I have about the Chauvin trial. And I am open to anyone who genuinely wants to have a conversation about this. I'm not actually interested in debating. That's not really something that I like to do. This is just me personally. I'm not interested in debating, especially not on this platform. But if you want to dialogue, then message me and I would love to talk to you. I have had so many people who have messaged me, and what they've said is, I don't have anyone else to talk to about this because I've also put myself in these spaces with everyone who thinks like me. And how do I talk to somebody about my questions about this? And I don't understand why these, what people mean when they say something is systemic, or there's these opportunities to be open to other people. And that might not be social media for most people, but how do we do that in our everyday life and present ourselves as people who are ready to have those dialogues? And I just think I love that challenge that you're offering us. That's just so good.
Stephanie, I have a question for you. It's maybe a bit of a tough one considering considering this space here. And that is, this particular vocational roundtable is focused on our everyday lives. And so in other vocational roundtables, we'll have folks who have been trained in public health or trained in criminal justice, talking with folks who have been trained in those areas, for years and working for decades. And one thing I'm curious about, especially within the context of, for example, a missional community, an invitation towards a missional community, is you have invited folks who don't necessarily have a lot of training or a lot of experience to do something pretty significant, and that potentially might have, they might do it well, they might not do it well. And as Presbyterians, we tend to we're a very highly educated, denomination, and I think that there's a lot of professionalization within the clergy. It's different, for example, than like evangelical. Me growing up in evangelical communities where some of the pastors were not necessarily, they didn't have an MDiv. So I'm curious about kind of how do you think about that? How do you think about inviting folks who might not have a lot of training or experience into this thing that has pretty significant consequences if it goes wrong? And how do you deal with that as a community when things don't go well? When you enter into spaces and somebody says or does something that's maybe damaging to a relationship. So just would be really curious. And again, I'm sorry I didn't tell you I was going to ask this question, but I'd be really curious to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging one for sure. I think I completely understand the drive towards learning that we all have. And I get that from other work that I've done with Presbyterians, but certainly let's not name only one group that would love to learn forever and not do anything if we can help it because it's risky and scary. And like, I can totally identify with that on a personal level. And so I think that there is sometimes I think of it as like a road with two ditches. And one ditch is, well, we're just going to jump in and see what happens. And that's going to put us in the ditch. And if we jump, the other road is, well, I just need to learn. And until I completely understand this, I'm not going to do it. And so one of the phrases that I often use is the idea of discernment through movement. And it's not the same as I'm going to, pick a strategic plan and jump in without any training, but I'm also not going to just get stuck and sit in a room until I know something. And so when we get up and move into different spaces, what happens is we have a different perspective, right? And so if I go to an open Ramadan dinner, and I'm not necessarily encouraging that right now with COVID and everything, but in the past and in the future, if I'm invited, it's a community invitation, then I come with a 100% learning posture. And but what did I do? I got up and I went. I didn't need to understand everything about Ramadan. In fact, that's what they're doing the dinners for. So we get to learn from them. And so I can do some research, I can learn, but I got to move. And when I move, I mean, just think of it very practically. If you're standing in one spot and you can see something over here, but if you move, 10 feet, you now have a different perspective. And so I think if we think of it as we've already talked about this, what is the lifelong commitments we're making and the steps that we're taking, and we think of it as a long-term thing, then we don't have to sprint. We can take a good pace where we're learning along the way and able to have less damage done. And then maybe more than anything, it's how do we find the people that we are to learn from, whether that's, directly or indirectly, whether we get to be with them physically or not. But there are so many opportunities to do that. So what I always encourage the missional community leaders is there is definitely people who are already doing what you guys want to do. Okay. There is no starting a new thing. In all of our years as a church, with as much, we have a lot of entrepreneurial energy, which is fantastic. A lot of learners too. But out of all of that, there's not been any new nonprofit or program started except for one time. And that really was because there was not, and that need was not being met. Other than that, it's joining in what other people who are already doing are doing. So we've got a group right now working on housing and homelessness, and some of them are social workers and have experience, but every single person in this group, 25 people that wanted to do this, I said, nobody is going to be a part of this group unless they watch these 5 videos of education and personally interview one-on-one somebody who's been doing this work for more than 10 years with the people experiencing homelessness or people facing housing insecurity or housing injustice. And so out goes 25 people to make 25 interviews, and then they come back with all these interviews and they learned all of this information. And man, one of the things they heard plenty of times is, well, one of the questions that they asked was, what's some of the harmful things the church people have done in this area? And they've said jumped in before they knew what they were doing. Mm-hmm. And so I can tell them that, or I can let them hear from people who have given so much of their life that information. And so I think that was a way of discernment through movement, right? That was a big risk for some people. They hadn't called somebody before and interviewed someone. But I just said, if you are passionate enough about this to say that you want to come here, so then you're hearing and you're learning, and you might have to deal with the fact that some of the choices you made in regards to the encampments weren't necessarily the best idea from a community development perspective. But you heard that because you took action and you learned and you stepped into those relationships in those spaces. And notice what I did not tell them to do was to go find somebody experiencing homelessness and interview them. You have to earn those opportunities, and the people you interviewed had already earned those opportunities. So that's just an example of pushing people towards active learning that takes us out of, just being in a room with other people like us, but also gets us closer to the ways we might join in to what God's doing in those different areas. So hopefully that's a good answer to it, but that's just what I actually do. That's all I can tell you.
I can also tell you that having an MDiv does not guarantee one won't make terrible mistakes in public.
I can guarantee that as a person with an MDiv as well. Absolutely, right.
Well, thank you to all of you for joining. Yeah. I think we're coming close to that magic 57-minute mark. And I really, really am grateful, Stephanie, for your perspective and your willingness to lead this discussion. And I appreciate learning from folks who are doing this in different models than we are, so we can learn from the models that others are using. And I also want to thank Doug and Susan and Taylor for being willing to be on camera with us having the conversation that we're having, and for sharing your wisdom and your lives with us as well. So thank you to you all.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for letting me be with you.
Thanks.
Thank you.